Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Njeri, and I'm a researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. I'll be facilitating this wonderful panel today. Welcome to Stream 1, Session 1. And the question we'll be debating today is COVID-19 a crisis of capitalism? And I hope you are in the right place because that is what we'll be discussing. We've got four really wonderful panelists and I'll be introducing them to you just before they give us some inputs. Here we have today, we've got Dr. Yannis Dafermos, Dr. Sara Stevano, Dr. Njeri, Mwagiru, Dr. Jason Musyoka. So many doctors, I feel this pressure to get on with my PhD. You know, I wish I could be sitting here as Dr. Musyoka myself. But starting us off will be Dr. Jason Musyoka, and who will be talking to us about the crisis of capitalism. How did we misunderstand the crisis? So welcome, Dr. Musyoka.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Busi. So for the opportunity to seek to perhaps deal or wrestle with this question on capitalism. I hope I'm clear enough.
Yes, we can hear you clearly. I'll be sharing your slides shortly.
Indeed. So thank you so much. So I don't know what you would like me to start with. Should I start just with the presentation?
Yes, please. Oh, I need to read your bio. You see, I'm already thinking about the slides. I've already gone ahead of myself. Okay, so let me introduce you properly to our attendees here today. So Dr. Jason Musyoka is a senior researcher at the University of Pretoria's Department of Political Science, having previously served as a board member of the Center for Advancement of Scholarship, University of Pretoria. He's also the group CEO of the Frontline Group, and the principal, the Frontline Training Institute. Dr. Jason is a distinguished academic and social science researcher with over 15 years of experience, part of which includes being a roster expert with the United Nations Global Policy Network. Dr. Jason is a thought leader on political economy of Africa, by which he features regularly on print and visual media, in addition to providing key addresses in platforms which range from the private sector to NGOs to government. A warm welcome there. And I'm already sharing your slides. Hope that everyone is able to see them.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Busi, and for the introduction as well. So the question is whether COVID-19 presents or is a crisis for capitalism. And the approach I decided to use to try and respond or wrestle with that question is a mix of empirical evidence in my assessment of how there could be shades of capitalism in the whole enterprise of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will try and trace some aspects of capitalism, how capitalism really has played out since the beginning of the pandemic, and how it's also featured in government's response to COVID. And I will give particular attention to South Africa as a sort of a case study. So this particular slide that you see here now is perhaps to launch with it. I thought perhaps we can begin by looking at the number of deaths that have occurred in the last year. These are annual death figures or mortality figures on various diseases. As you can see right at the top, I will explain the context shortly, but you've got the topmost leading global killer is hunger-related diseases. And we know that for the most part, this would situate Asia and Africa in that context quite clearly. And then you've got a heart disease and what you see at the far end of the bars there are actually millions of people who die every year. So ischemic heart disease kills just under 9 million, almost the same as hunger-related diseases and starvation. Thirdly, you've got stroke, which is the third largest killer. And you've got about 6.2 million people who die every year. Then you've got COVID as number 4, with about 2.7 million. I just calculated that figure based on the latest. I think we're looking at 4.5 million at the moment, but if you recalibrate that into 12 months, then you arrive at a 2.7 million. Sorry, then still on.
Oh, sorry. I'm checking here. So still on this slide, sorry.
That's fine. Then you've got lower respiratory diseases. I think it's moving real fast.
That is my computer.
Oh, see, sorry.
Unfortunately, there you go.
So we're finishing the second one, the one before, then that one. No, before that. That one. So then you've got tuberculosis, which is also one of the leading killers. And then you've got HIV and AIDS, 1 million people per year. The key question is, why is it that we have not responded to, or governments the world over and corporates, financial institutions have not responded in the same way that they have not responded to COVID in the same way that, or to these other killers in the same way that they've responded to COVID. So there seem to be some unique way in which we've responded to COVID. And from a neo-Marxist perspective, I will offer perhaps some answers that seek to wrestle with that question. Why the response, the stimulus packages, we've got lockdowns, we've got all of that. And I know that it's very easy to dismiss the neo-Marxist perspective or even Marxist assessment of class relations and perhaps settle for an easy analysis that suggests that it's COVID, it's communicable disease, but so is tuberculosis, so are most of these other diseases as well. So there is a particular way in which we need perhaps to wrestle and to understand why the response has been as drastic and as unique as it has been for COVID. And I will try and clarify on that point. So moving on to the next slide, I thought perhaps moving from launching of my presentation to then look at the fact that COVID has had significant impact on multinational corporations. And again, this is where we begin to perhaps employ neo-Marxist lenses to look at how capital seems to relate with the pandemic and then begin to answer perhaps why the response has been drastic, and that we will seek to clarify. So firstly, the aviation and maritime industries, along with the commodity markets, so exporting of gold and coal and platinum and so on, were the first victims of COVID-19 as far as corporate capital is concerned. The industry, in particular aviation industry's global economic impact, both direct, indirect, induced and catalytic, contributes trillions to the global GDP. And again, just to give some figures there, over 3 point, these are the industry, the aviation industry contributes over $3.5 trillion in world economic activity. That's 4.1% of global GDP. If the aviation industry was a country, it would be among the leading 20, among the G20 countries. It would be equivalent to countries such as Argentina and so forth, and certainly much bigger than South Africa. So that gives you a sense of how COVID really attacked a major part of capital production. And therefore, my argument here is that it was necessary for capital institutions to respond drastically in defense of capitalism. The airport industry was expected to generate 200 billion in 2020 before COVID-19 outbreak. And as you will see in the slide that I will show shortly, which comes next after this, the impact of the pandemic on the aviation industry has reduced revenues by 64.7%. And lastly, on this point, in last year, over 40 airlines filed bankruptcy, and South African Airlines was among those, although there has been ongoing crisis, but the final blow was, of course, COVID-19. And then the US President Trump at the time announced that 58 billion bailout for the aviation industry in the US alone. Now, moving on to the next one, and as we sort of transition there, the key point I'm trying to make here is that COVID-19 was really a crisis of, or it sought to create a major crisis as far as profit making is concerned. It was therefore necessary for the world to respond not so much about livelihoods, not so much about lives, but perhaps much more on livelihoods, which of course you begin to play into the way the capitalism system works. This chart here shows you some sense of a trend. We've got a series of capitalism crises that have been documented well enough. You've got the oil crisis of the 1970s. You've got the Iraq-Iran war. You've got the Gulf crisis, Asian crisis, 9/11. You've got SARS, and you've got the financial crisis. But what you see here is that none of each of these crises had any significant impact on the aviation industry in particular. Keep in mind what I indicated earlier, this is 4.1% of global GDP. So if you look right at the end, you've got COVID-19, and over the last century, almost, COVID-19 is the only crisis or pandemic that has delivered significant blow to the airline industry and creating negative 60% decline in as far as the aviation industry revenues are concerned. So if you look at the data there, you can begin to understand why the scrambling, why the IMF, for example, was able to provide the highest bailout in history. The World Bank, the same thing, and governments is scrambling with their stimulus packages in a significant way to respond to a health crisis as if it was a financial crisis. And yet it wasn't. It was not a financial crisis, at least on the surface. But if you dig deeper, you realize it was a financial crisis of sorts. The only thing, of course, here is that it was a threat to the system itself, not necessarily to the monumental impact that the financial crisis had, not least because a lot of data suggests that pandemics don't really destroy capital per se. They reorganize, they halt the growth of capital, but they don't destroy capital like a war, for example. But even then, the threat was there of a large chunk of the financial or the operating of the capitalist system. So moving on to the next one. So I want to move on now to South Africa in particular, having laid the foundation on a global scale, and to look at the COVID-19 and how it's played out in the South African capitalist ecosystem. Again, I will still maintain a neo-Marxist lenses or analytical framework in looking at the interaction between institutions, the state on one side, multinational corporations and large bureaucracies that tend to serve the interests of capital to a good extent. Now I begin to suggest that the government rolled out 500 billion rand stimulus package, as we know, and this was largely to cover social safety net for the poor and the working class, but also for businesses, which included issues of taxes and so on, reducing of taxes and so forth and so on. I think what's of interest for us in this particular discussion is that the social relief program that government included or expanded the social grant system to include a social relief program, about 350 rand, which was being given out. It was to cover a large chunk of poor households. And this is something that the government has never done in its history, at least since 1994. And therefore, government was expected to deliver what it has never delivered. We've not been able as a country to deliver on basic services over the last 20 or so years. And yet, within a short span of time, there was expectation that government was going to roll out, and that assumed the capacity of the state to address such a large or complex issue. The president underscored that the relief program was about saving lives. And that's where I have issues in my assessment that this is, as much as this sounded politically correct, but my argument is that it was really about livelihoods, not so much of the poor. The system itself was very asymmetric as far as who really benefited even out of the 500 billion stimulus package that was rolled out. And my argument here is that if it was about saving lives, so is HIV and AIDS response. It's also about saving lives. And my calculation is that between 1997 and 2012, a population equivalent to the whole of Durban in South Africa died. There has not been this kind of scrambling of whether stimulus packages or even significant responses. And yet, as far as COVID-19 was concerned, we were very drastic in response. It's also useful to note that roughly 2,000 children in the country die in hospital every year from malnutrition-related conditions. And so it goes. So if I move to the next one, the next slide. So as I complete my sense, and what I was trying to demonstrate earlier is that in the previous slide there is the fact that as much as the language is there, but the system itself has a way of ensuring that allocation of resources do not go to the poorest of the poor or to the working class, that it goes ultimately to your middle classes and to your upper classes. And I got some few examples for if you look at by June 2020, SASSA had administered only 1.2%. This is 2 months after the announcing of the stimulus package. The target that had been reached was a mere 1.2%. I also looked up for the progress made by this month, last month, which was yesterday, August 2020, and the system has only been able to deliver 50% of the target. The police and military were deployed to force the working class and the poor to submit to the guidelines of impersonal bureaucracy. My point being here that I think there were a lot of images that we saw in the media where the military was there to ensure people queue, and some of them were queuing for days, sleeping over and waiting for their handout of the 350. The question is whether that's really necessary, and especially considering that we were dealing with a bureaucracy that was highly inefficient, and then these individuals, the poor and the working class, were forced to submission or to submit to a bureaucracy that is not efficient, that is impersonal, that does not recognize that that grant is, for some people, a matter of life and death. I also would like to suggest that if you look outside of the SASSA system, you also see mining companies. Studies suggest that the mining companies embarked on the largest transportation of labor from Lesotho and Botswana and out of the country to ship in cheap labor to continue doing mining during COVID-19, in spite of COVID-19 regulations. And so you sort of see, and that was legal as far as the government was concerned. And as a matter of fact, when everybody else was locked down, the mines were left open. And then lastly, on this point, organizations such as Liberty Life took the government to court, not because they were starving or because there was no food for the poor, but because they were fighting for the right to wash hands and to exercise. The point being made in this slide here is that you can see whose interests are dominant in this entire process of responding to COVID-19. And then moving on to the last one. So my last slide is, in conclusion, in the final analysis, it is necessary to revisit the old age question as to whether capitalism is well equipped to address poverty in a meaningful and effective way. Harris White would say it is not. It is instead responsible for creating poverty and inequality conditions. And I do agree with the fact that capitalism has tended to thrive on these conditions of poverty and inequality, which are really crises. The development success of South Africa's social response to COVID-19 is largely constrained, therefore, by the architecture of capitalism or dominant interests of those who have means of production, as I have alluded to earlier. Some of the potentially effective opportunities which could break such development impulse or even tingle the capitalist system from the crude way in which it has tended to operate in South Africa and elsewhere might lie in finding and using informal systems for humanitarian and development interventions. Of course, this is a hard sell, but it would be useful to look at ways in which informal settings might serve in a better way than large bureaucracies that hide behind rules and regulations and power. And then lastly, COVID-19 dealt a significant blow to capitalism. That is true. But as capitalism always does, it's fought back in defense of its dominance and its contradictions. Thank you so much. Back to you, Busi.
Thank you, and thank you for that. Apologies, my laptop has a mind of its own and does what it pleases, much probably like the capitalists that you've just spoken to us about. Thank you for that sober inputs and really talking about the state of affairs in South Africa and how capitalism is fighting, through it all. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Sara Stevano. Dr. Sara Stevano is a development and feminist political economist with interdisciplinary skills in the field of anthropology. She's a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS London. After holding different teaching and research positions at the University of West England, Bristol, and King's College London, her areas of study are the political economy of labor, food and nutrition, social reproduction, gender analysis, and research methodology. Her work focuses on Africa, Mozambique, and Ghana in particular. Dr. Sara Stevano, please take us away.
Thank you so much, Buzi. And I would like to say that it's always a pleasure to be part of the Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival, which I think is a great initiative. So thank you so much for having me. So in the next 10 minutes, I will try to provide a Marxist feminist perspective on how to understand and make sense of the COVID-19 crisis. But before I get to that part, I would like to begin by providing a bit of a straightforward answer to the question that we are discussing, which is COVID-19 a crisis of capitalism? And my answer is yes, and I'm very much in agreement with where Dr. Jason has ended up with his presentation. So I'm not sure that COVID-19 is a crisis for capitalism, and particularly in terms of what will happen next, but it is certainly a crisis of capitalism. And this is because this crisis has exposed structural vulnerabilities that are at the core of the functioning of neoliberal and financialized capitalism. And these structural vulnerabilities are visible, or in a way, one of the most visible symptoms of these structural vulnerabilities are multiple and intersected inequalities, which is what my presentation will be focusing on. And just before I get into the Marxist feminist analysis of all of this, I would like to say that most of what I'm going to say is based on collaborative research that I've conducted since the beginning of the pandemic with colleagues at SOAS. Yannis Dafermos is one of them, and he will be the next speaker, but also colleagues at the Institute for Social and Economic Studies in Mozambique and the Open University in the UK. So starting with this idea that we need to understand how this COVID-19 crisis has exposed multiple and intersected inequalities, a Marxist feminist lens is essential to capture these structural vulnerabilities and inequalities. And this is because this lens allows us to analyze the articulations between the organization of production and the organization of social reproduction, which are, of course, intimately interconnected from a Marxist feminist perspective. So just to be clear on the definitions, when we talk about capitalist production, I think this is something that we can all relate to. But when we talk about social reproduction, and I'm aware that there is a wonderful session with Lean, which I think is happening at the moment on social reproduction. And there are other sessions at REFA this year that talk about social reproduction, which I think is very important because it's a crucial component, I think, for understanding the nature of the COVID-19 crisis. And so the definition that I use, and of course I'm not the only one, of social reproduction is quite a broad one, and it refers to all of the work, whether it is paid or unpaid, but also the social and material practices that are needed to reproduce economic and social relations. So in this sense, social reproduction includes unpaid care and household work, but it's not limited to it. Social reproduction also includes education, the provision of health and social care, the provision of basic infrastructure, and also a range of social practices such as rituals and ceremonies. So everything that is needed to reproduce our economy and society, of course, in the context of contemporary capitalism nowadays. And so why is it important to look at this articulation between production and social reproduction? Because it is how the division of labor on who does what in relation to production and social reproduction, and how this labor is valued or in fact devalued, particularly when it comes to the work of social reproduction. So it's this division of labor and these hierarchies of values that create structural inequalities. And so, taking a Marxist feminist perspective, we can see how COVID-19 has triggered a crisis of work, where work is meant in the feminist understanding of it, which is in its totality of reproductive and productive work. And COVID-19 has acted as a magnifying glass of pre-existing inequalities. So some of the inequalities that we're seeing more clearly during the pandemic are not new, but they have been amplified and intensified by the COVID-19 crisis. So how do we look at this process? So in, again, collaborative work with various colleagues, we have provided a sort of conceptual framework that is based on the need of analyzing transformations that have taken place both at the level of the household and at the level of the labor markets or the broader world of work. Where, of course, what happens at the level of the household and what happens at the level of the labor markets are fundamentally intertwined, which is a key feminist insight. And so just to start very briefly with the pre-existing inequalities that I have been mentioning a few times, I would like to highlight how at the level of the household, it is very important to look at the types of inequalities that have been created during neoliberalism, because this is the phase through which households have become increasingly responsible for welfare provisioning. And so to make a bit of a generalization, we can say that in the global north, there has been a retreat of the state from the provision of basic social services. And so feminists have been analyzing this process and they have called it a privatization of social reproduction, because families and households have become increasingly responsible for their own welfare and well-being. And in many cases, not only in the global north, but also in some contexts of the global south, this has gone hand in hand with processes of financialization, which means that families and households have had to become heavily indebted in order to meet their basic social needs. What happened in the global south, and this is again, I'm making quite a big generalization, is not so much a similar retreat of the state, although that also happened, but it's a more complex process of fragmentation of the means of social reproduction, particularly through the commodification of life. And so it has become increasingly difficult for people, for the working classes in the global south to meet the needs for their own social reproduction during neoliberalism. And so this is something that can be seen when we look at what has happened in the past few decades, since the 1970s and 80s up to today, at the level of households. And it is important to bear in mind that when we think about inequalities, we want to think about inequalities across households, but also within households, which is particularly important from a gender perspective, as documented in much feminist work. But at the same time, in the world of work or in the labor markets on a global scale, we have seen processes of precarization and casualization of work. And so there have been processes of informalization of labor also occurring in the global north, but also adverse incorporation of workers into global value chains, or even the expulsion of people from and workers from global production networks, with very severe implications for their ability to meet the needs of social reproduction. And so this is to say, it's a very quick summary, of course, and we could be spending a lot of time on this. But the point that I want to make is that the COVID-19 crisis hit the world in an already precarious situation in terms of inequalities that are a symptom of structural fragilities produced in the context of neoliberal and financialized capitalism. And so how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact pre-existing inequalities? And here I would like to highlight two key dynamics to understand this impact. On the one hand, there has been an intensification of social reproduction work taking place in households. And what has been important, particularly in the first phases of the pandemic, is also a disruption, a breakdown of those inter-household and community forms of exchange that have taken place due to the lockdown policies that have been implemented in many contexts in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The second key dynamic is a shift of balance between sectors of the economy considered to be low-skilled and those considered to be high-skilled. So again, drawing or making a bit of a generalization also here, we can say that low skill and social reproduction work has been designated as essential in many countries across the world. And this was particularly important in the first phase of the pandemic. But so it is very clear that the lockdown policies, for example, have not meant the same for everyone. So to start with, some people could not stay at home. In some cases, these workers were classified as essential, which meant that they got some social recognition and praise in some countries. But in fact, in material terms, they didn't gain much more, or in fact, nothing more at all. And of course, in the case of some essential workers, they've also been more exposed to the disease as they continue to work during the pandemic. Other workers became unemployed, and some lucky and privileged ones, such as myself, were able to continue to work from home. So it is evident that depending on our occupations, for example, we have been impacted by this crisis very differently. What is important to us here is to reflect on how working class people, Black and brown people, women and migrants are overrepresented among both the essential workers and those who became unemployed. So through employment, I've used this example, the COVID-19 pandemic has created an equal impact on grounds of class, race, gender, and migration status. And of course, we could think about other examples. For example, in terms of who we live with and where, how we access healthcare and what kind of underlying health conditions we have, whether we have caring responsibilities and how we access means of transport. So these are all channels through which multiple and intersected inequalities have intensified during the pandemic. I'm aware of the time, Buzi. I'm almost done. So just before I conclude, I would like to add this point because I think from a feminist perspective, but not only, it is very important to also consider a global South lens, if you want. So to understand how these inequalities that I've been talking about take place not only within national contexts or at the local level, but in fact, they also occur on a global scale. And in fact, it is true that some countries have been more successful at managing the health crisis than others in ways that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, escaped those typical divides between rich and poor countries, countries in the global South and countries in the global North. And of course, there are lessons to be learned from the experience of the countries that have been more successful at managing the pandemic, even with perhaps a poorer infrastructure and knowledge and preparation than others. And some of these countries indeed are in the African continent. However, such unevenness in responses does not take away from the perpetuation of structural divides between the global South and the global North. This is true in terms of the fiscal space that different governments have and can use, the position of different countries in the global financial architecture, and broadly speaking, the productive and reproductive structures. So if we look at the world of work, it is clear that the most vulnerable working classes on a global scale, which are informal workers, the migrant workers, the workers at the bottom of global supply chains, have experienced the most dramatic implications of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, while some peripheral countries, such as Mozambique, have designated essentially 2/3 of their workforce as essential, because in a way or in another, these are workers that are involved in food and agricultural production, this has not translated into a secure livelihood for the vast majority of these workers. And so to conclude, I would like to say that the COVID-19 crisis not only is a crisis of capitalism, but in fact it's an indictment on our economies and society, in that it has thrown into sharp relief the fragility of working and living conditions for gendered and racialized working classes on a global scale. And therefore, the only way out of this crisis is the creation of a socioeconomic system that centers on the vital importance of social reproduction and stops perpetuating an unfair division of labor based on class, gender, race, and citizenship status. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry I probably took 1 or 2 extra minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for outlining really the crisis of social reproduction that we are seeing within this crisis of capitalism more broadly. And to say that I'll be introducing Dr. Yannis Dafermos next. Dr. Yannis Dafermos is a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS University of London. He's also senior research fellow at SOAS Center for Sustainable Finance and a fellow at the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies, FMM. His research interests include financial macroeconomics, climate change and finance, ecological macroeconomics, climate policies and economic development, and inequality. His work has been published in several academic journals, such as the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Ecological Economics, the Journal of Financial Stability, and Nature Climate Change. And I'll be, well, it's your turn to give us the great input that you have prepared for us.
Thank you so much, Buzi. And first of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this brilliant festival. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. So I'm going to talk about the COVID-19 crisis from ecological and economics perspective. And what I'm going to do is first to say a couple of things about the key lessons that, in my view, we have learned from the COVID-19 crisis. I will explain why these lessons are important for another crisis that we are facing, the climate crisis. And after that, I would like to reflect a bit on the question of whether COVID-19 is a crisis not only of capitalism, but as Sara mentioned before, if it is a crisis for capitalism. So let me start by saying a couple of things about what we have learned from the COVID-19 crisis from an ecological perspective. And one first lesson that we have learned from this crisis, which is very clear, is that over the last decades, the type of capitalism that has dominated the world has led to an overexploitation of nature. And we know that this overexploitation of nature has made us more exposed to nature-related phenomena. And I would like to point out that although we do not have clear evidence about the impact that our exploitation of nature had on COVID-19, we know that there are many ecologists who for many years pointed out that the way that we use nature, deforestation, the loss of biodiversity, increases the risk of having diseases as COVID-19. And at the same time, we have very clear evidence that the way that we have exploited nature, for example, our consumption patterns, have led to the burning of fossil fuels, and we know that this has contributed to global warming. So the first lesson that we need to have in our mind is that we really need to change the way that we relate with nature. And if we don't do that, we are going to see more nature-related phenomena that are going to cause significant human suffering. The second lesson is that the way that the global economic and financial system have been designed do not protect us from shocks that come from nature in a way that is socially just. And this is very clear. I mean, Sara talked a lot about the way that intersecting inequalities were affected by COVID-19, and the fact that we already had a lot of inequalities there before COVID-19, but COVID-19 reinforced these inequalities. I would like to focus also on the fact that COVID-19 has exposed the problems that we have with the global financial system. And something that was extremely clear when we had the COVID-19 pandemic was that there were some countries in the global north that had the ability to use the so-called magic money tree in order to print money electronically and support their economies and their people. So a lot of the economic packages that we saw in countries in the global north relied on the fact that their central banks could very easily support these packages by using their ability to create money. On the other hand, countries in the global south could not use their magic money tree in the same way. They didn't have the capacity to implement expansionary fiscal policy in the same way. They didn't have the capacity to give so many social benefits to people and to protect them from COVID-19. And this illustrates the significant inequalities that are embedded into the global financial architecture. And when it comes to the climate crisis, this is something that it's extremely clear, because on the one hand, we have that the crisis has been created primarily by the emissions of countries in the global north and by the emissions of rich people. But on the other hand, those who suffer more from the crisis are those who are poor and are in the global south. And it's extremely clear that the countries in the global south cannot have the financial capacity that allows them, for instance, to support people in cases in which we have climate-related events like floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and so on. So a key message is that the current system that we have doesn't work. I mean, it didn't work in many different ways in the past, but it doesn't work at all in the current situation, whereby we expect to be hit by many nature-related shocks. And the last lesson that I would like to point out is that if we want to have a system that allows us to live within the limits of a finite planet, it's necessary to get rid of the free market ideology. And this became very clear with COVID-19. First of all, countries that had stronger health public systems were in a better position to protect their population. Countries that were in a position to use state intervention managed to address the crisis in a better way. And in terms of economic thinking, it's also very crucial to understand that when we are talking about our finite planet, we have some very significant interactions between what we do in our economies and the ecological systems. And if we don't understand these interactions and take action in order to address them in a way that is sustainable, we are going to have significant collapses of our social and economic systems. If we look at the climate crisis, these lessons are also very clear. Why? Because we cannot have the transition to low carbon economies without a very significant intervention from the state. We are not going to have the ability to adapt to the new reality of climate change without having strong public systems that will protect the population from the effects of the climate crisis. And we cannot design our response to the climate crisis if we don't understand very well how our economic activities create problems to our ecological systems. So I think the third lesson, which is also very important for economic thinking, is that we really need to get rid of this idea that we just rely on what is good for individuals in order to get an outcome that is good for the society. Now, if we take into account these three lessons, it's quite clear that COVID-19 and the climate crisis are the result and have been significantly caused by capitalism. Capitalism has reinforced the negative effects of this crisis on our societies and our economies. And capitalism, in the way at least that we have seen this over the last decades, does not allow us to respond to this crisis in a way that is socially just and effective. However, despite the fact that this is a crisis of capitalism, we don't know if capitalism is going to collapse because of COVID-19 or the climate crisis. And here I would like to be a bit more provocative and say that, of course, we don't know what is going to happen in the future. But I think we can think of some possibilities that might become a reality in the coming years. And I think it's important for us to think a little bit about the future of capitalism in the context of this crisis. And one possibility is to see a small transformation of capitalism in a way that allow those who have the power in the system to adjust to the new reality, whereby the new reality is that we might have more health crisis and more ecological crisis. And I would like to refer to a term that one of my co-authors, Daniela Gabor, has coined. This is a term Wall Street consensus, and refers to the fact that the global financial system is now in a period whereby it tries to adjust to this new reality in a way that allows it to continue being dominant at the global level. So the Wall Street consensus capitalism is a capitalism that creates financial assets that can support spending in health and climate issues in a way that preserves its profitability, but is very bad for the well-being of the population. And this is a very significant, a very likely outcome of the COVID-19 crisis, because we have already seen specific agendas that have been promoted, for instance, by the World Bank, whereby the idea is that the private sector will invest in health and climate. This will create some profitability opportunities for global banks, and global banks will be presented through this framework and these ideas as those that are going to save capitalism. So this is one possibility. And I think it's a very likely outcome, as I said before. However, the fact that we have this nature-related crisis calls into question capitalism in a more fundamental way. And I think that depending on what will be the distribution of power within countries, but also at the global level, we might see some more significant changes. Because in my view, the crisis will become much more severe in the coming years. And in that sense, it is likely that we will see some redistribution of political power. I mean, we will hopefully see a new role for local communities. And I think it will become clear that the state will have to intervene more compared to what has been the case in the past. Overall, it's an outcome that really depends on what is going to happen at the political level. But I think we are living in the period whereby the crisis will be very severe, probably more severe compared to what we have seen in the past. The global south is going to be affected very much by this crisis. And my hope is that this is going to call into question some very significant ideas that have become dominant in the economic thinking over the last decades. And this is an opportunity for having new ideas becoming dominant, and probably to have something more positive coming from this crisis. But as I said, this really depends on what is going to happen at the political level. So that's all. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. You asked some very critical questions there, ones that I actually will be putting back to the panel when we get to the questions and answers. Just to remind all the attendees that, we will be taking questions. We won't have a lot of time for questions, but to please put them in the Q&A box so that we don't miss any of your questions that you may have. And thank you for that. I mean, what stands out to me is just, the departing from the free market ideology, which there's already a question I'm seeing around that. We'll discuss that later. And last but not least, we have Dr. Njeri Mwagiru. And Dr. Mwagiru is a senior futurist at the Institute for Futures Research, University of Stellenbosch Business School. Her work focuses on strengthening capabilities of individuals, organizations, and countries in Africa to navigate complexity and uncertainty to realize long-term goals and visions. Her research interests include leadership, organizational performance, knowledge, gender and diversity, inclusivity, and transformation. Dr. Mwagiru has a master's in international relations and holds a PhD in business administration. She's also a co-founder of a research and business development organization that facilitates long-term institutional partnership building. I'll be handing over to you and hoping that you might start to answer some of the questions about the future and sort of like some of the policies that we can think about. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Busi, and it's a pleasure to join this Rethinking Economics Festival, and I'm pleased to be joining my co-panelists in this very interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to contributing a futures perspective to this debate on whether or not COVID-19 is a crisis of or for capitalism, and where we are going from here. So I will be sharing some thoughts from, firstly, to begin and shape my few comments. Let me just get this going. So firstly, to shape my few comments, I'll be sharing some key futures concepts, namely complexity, discussing complexity and multiplicity. I think as Dr. Sara and Dr. Yannis have already very clearly outlined, we are facing multiple intersecting crises, and there are differential impacts that the COVID-19 is triggering and spotlighting. So I'll focus a few of my comments there, but not too much, as it's been mostly covered by the previous presentations. I'll also talk a little bit about dynamism and change, recognizing that we live in a changing world with different change trajectories. And therefore, what does this mean in terms of what COVID-19 is presenting to our systems, capitalism being one of them? And then a focus on inclusion, participation, and imagination, asking the question, how can we leverage collective intelligence, our various and diverse expertise, comparative advantages to overcome the crises, not only in terms of capitalism and COVID, but also perhaps the crises in our imagination in terms of thinking of alternative models, enhanced systems, processes that can allow us to realize the kinds of economies, political realities, societies that we would wish to live in and work in. And then finally, agency and action. So what steps can we take within this current context of the COVID-19 crisis, but also within the context of broader crises that we're facing, as Dr. Yannis has pinpointed, as so has Dr. Sara, and what steps can we take to realize better futures for ourselves? I really appreciate Dr. Musyoka laying some great groundwork of what the impacts have been at a corporate level, and I hope to also share some examples of what some responses have also been. So complexity and multiplicity really is to underscore and emphasize this point that has been highlighted by the previous speakers, which is that COVID-19 is triggering and spotlighting multiple crises, from an economic and financial crisis, and capitalism is definitely implicated here, but we also have the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. We've got the climate crises, we've got mental health pandemics and crises as well. Then there's crises of social justice and inequity and humanitarian crises across various disciplines and geographical spaces if we look at the conflict and war space. And we could even have debates about whether we're facing crises of democracy and crisis of the state. So what interests us from a futures perspective about these crises and this current context is the intersections, the widespread implications, and the differential impacts. And this perspective highlights for us that in as much as these problems are intricate and complex and complicated, the solutions, therefore, that we require or that we might want to innovate around will necessarily have to also be intricate, complex, and multiple. So it's important from a futures perspective, and we emphasize the value of engaging multiple positionalities, standpoints, and positions in order for us to understand the possible futures represented in these, and therefore what these multiple crises mean, but also what the opportunities may be for reform and transformation. And this brings me to the points of dynamism and change. So an important point to realize as we debate these crises of capitalism, of the economy, of climate, of gender, of labor, of work, is that we live in a changing world. The very popular acronym of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, is one that we can call on to frame this changing world that we live in. but it's important to understand that the systems that we are observing, including capitalism, are not static. They shift, they decline, they reform, they renew, they transform. So systems respond to change, systems respond as well to adversity, and they respond to opportunities. So are there possibilities of collapse given what we're seeing in terms of the multiple crises, the collapse of capitalism? This is definitely a possibility. From a futures perspective, we see that there are multiple possible futures available to us. Are there possibilities of reform? I think, as Dr. Yannis mentioned, yes, and it could be reform in a way that adds more power to the status quo with the Wall Street consensus, or it could be reform that shifts more towards political and social transformative and perhaps radical change. The important thing to recognize here is that we do have points of leverage and intervention within which we can intersect with this dynamism and change within systems to have an influence of the direction within which the crises are unfolding and how we are responding to them. So in discussing this dynamism and change within the system, I would like to focus on some of the work that we're doing within the University of Stellenbosch Business School and also at the Institute for Futures Research that looks at changing these systems of crises, of inequalities that have structural, as Dr. Sara mentioned, that have structural fragilities, and also as Dr. Musyoka painted, the ways in which these corporations operate within these broader systems. So within the business school, we engage with transformation from within. There's also, of course, the possibility of transformation from without. And here I want to just acknowledge the Marxist and feminist perspectives, but also the radical movements of change and social protests that we are seeing globally, and recognize that these too could be triggers of futures of capitalism that lead us more towards collapse. But from a business school perspective and the work we do at the Futures Institute, we work very much with organizations and businesses to enhance the ways in which they are adapting and leveraging their particular positions within markets and within the system to shift themselves as organizations, but also their community context, the context of their customers, and the context of their broader stakeholder base towards preferred futures that offer benefits on a much broader scale. So some examples of the work that we're doing that seeks to make changes from within is, for instance, the League of Entrepreneurs that works with change agents within corporate organizations aiming to shift their policy and operational structures to impact social and community initiatives and ensure that business has got long-term positive impacts for the context they operate in. There's also the House of Beautiful Business Network that's seeking to find ways to bring ethics of beauty, of care, of love more into business. We can talk about the Afro-capitalism perspective that seeks to bring a human face and to center African heritage, cultures, and communities within capitalist systems. And I mention these also because at a broader level, for instance, within the Club of Rome, the director of the Institute for Futures Research has been having a conversation on how can we rethink value and apply our imagination and innovation to shift and adapt the system in a way that can allow for fundamental changes at a conceptual level that can then hopefully create more opportunity for the systems to function operatively and optimally in a way that leads to sustenance and sustainability and that leads to social justice and equity as opposed to simply extractive models. And in shaping the possibilities and giving these examples, I hope to emphasize the fact that we do have agency and action, and the idea that we can create the futures that we would wish to realize, and that the futures that we wish to create start necessarily from the positions we occupy today, recognizing, as Dr. Musyoka mentioned, that capitalism is resilient, it has shown itself to be, but recognizing also that it has structural fragilities that can offer opportunities for change, as Dr. Sara has outlined. And finally, as Dr. Yannis has painted, there are possible futures either towards reform that reinforce the status quo and power structures as they are, or that open the possibilities for transformation. I would add to the closing arguments of Dr. Yannis that it's not only political action and agency that are important here, but action and agency across the multiplicity of levels and standpoints represented in the various interests that shape and intersect within the systems of capitalism capitalism, but also within the systems of resistance, within and outside the systems of capitalism, and of course, the various intersecting points with the other crises that we face. So in thinking around what may be the responses of this system, but also our broader responses within this context of crises, I want to emphasize the point of prosilience within the Futures Institute. We've been dealing with, that's my time, I beg your pardon. We've been dealing with a model of recovery that seeks to focus on futures and foresight thinking in terms of anticipation and preparedness for disruption and crises, but also that encourages adaptation and agility within systems so that you pull on the positive points in order to recover in a way that prepares you and reinforces you to build on your positives and to let go of your negatives. And finally, to leave with the question that perhaps the debate we need to focus on is not so much whether we are in a crisis, but how we will come out of these crises and build not only back better, but build forward and upward in a way that enhances as opposed to depreciates the opportunities available to us now. Thanks so much, Busi. I hope my few comments from a futures perspective have enriched the discussion and hopefully triggered some interesting questions and reflections from participants. I really look forward to seeing where this conversation goes.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that, and really highlighting just how dynamic capitalism is, and it really challenges all of us to think about these intersecting ways that it functions and how to truly challenge, the current status quo. And so we've got a number of questions here, and unfortunately, due to time, we won't be able to unpack and answer all of them fully. But what we'll be doing is that I'll put the questions on the floor and ask each speaker to kind of give, a response to the questions, but also closing remarks. So asking all of you to put in, 3 minutes closing remarks. But thank you to all our wonderful attendees for putting some of these questions here. I don't know how everyone is feeling, but I'm feeling like capitalism is a mountain that we have to climb, and we just have to climb it. And so much has been said. I'll probably be processing it over the next couple of days. And so I'm just going to read out some of the questions. There's a question here for Dr. Jason. When it comes to the top causes of death, would you say that hunger-related deaths are caused by capitalism and colonialization, since they brought about poverty, while in other countries, obesity and stress with the same reason as the first question? There's also here a question about, we've spoken of effects of COVID-19 on households and companies, but have we seen any real global or national policy change recommendations emanating from the pandemic actually challenging capitalistic structures and supporting informal, individual, territorial, domestic trade? There's another question here about, how would nations start to depart from the free market ideology? And it's really a question about cherry picking the goods and the bads of capitalism itself. And there's a question here around the teaching question. And I know, and some of you are lecturers. How would we approach teaching about the crisis of capitalism to students that are deeply suspicious of any critique of capitalism? And the last question, Africa as a continent is clearly on receiving end of COVID, but all figures we've been shown say it has least ratios, deaths, infected, daily rates, and recovered. Some of governments believe prayers are a solution. Western powers are still pointing fingers where it started. Africa cannot engage in that. Was it a target? Very controversial question there at the end. But really, we'll just go through in the order that our speakers spoke. Dr. Jason, would you like to start us off?
Thank you so much, Busi. I hope you can hear me okay. We were starting to lose you, so I'm not sure that it's your side or our side. Am I clear? Hi, Busi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Please, I don't know if you missed some of my questions. Did I take off at the end there with the last controversial question?
I did. I got, although it was fading along the way, but I got your question. So thanks. So firstly, to respond on the question of hunger-related deaths as is a cause of capitalism, It's always useful to look at the perspective that one is adopting, or the kind of analytical framework that you're looking at. And the classic Marxism might not give us answers to that in particular, because it focuses very much on Weberian lenses. So according to Max Weber, then you begin to understand, or that question becomes a little bit more clearer, because Weberian class analysis suggests that what you bring to the market is what determines your social status. And by that, he meant those or opportunities that you've already acquired. When you come into the market empty-handed, of which most of the poor, that's really what happens, then there's a probabilistic aspect there. You are locked into almost a permanent intergenerational state of poverty. And by that, or from that perspective, my response would be yes. If you look at hunger-related deaths, it is a cause of capitalism, in the sense that those who get affected most are either health poor or food poor. And the fact that they come in, or what they bring to the market is very minimal, they are therefore locked in that cycle of high levels of mortality. And so it is a function of capitalism in a sense. And to answer your other question, I don't know, some of my colleagues, I think, might respond to some, but on the cherry picking that we are suggesting, what aspects of capitalism can we work with? Of course, when we make proposals of working within informal institutions rather than large bureaucracies, we are also fully aware that informal institutions are not going to launch satellites in space. So it's important to perhaps also do some checking on what kind of, certainly in my area of work, what kind of corporations might be much more relevant to the cause of equality and so forth and so on. So I think that would be my second. Perhaps I would respond to a third one. But again, my colleagues, I'm sure, would respond to that. So I think it was Smanga who asked about whether capitalism has been able to produce any benefits for the poor during this time. And the answer is, of course, it always produces some form of benefits. The key issue around capitalism is inequality. If you look at how it's allocated resources during COVID-19, some people received 350 Rand in South Africa, but others received millions, and others became COVID-19 billionaires that we're talking about. So the key question really is not whether it's delivered any benefit, it's the kind of benefits it's delivered proportionally. If you look at mainly the precariat class, and the middle classes and the upper classes. So that really is the key question. Thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you. And I'll be passing on now to Dr. Stevano.
Thank you so much, Buzi, and to all of the participants for having taken the time and having put these questions to us. So I'll start with perhaps not a full answer, but some reflections on the free market ideology question, and then I'll touch upon the trade one. And perhaps I'll say something at the end on the question by Michelle on teaching. So the free market ideology, I think what needs to be said is that the free market ideology has always been fictitious, in that, in the reality, free markets has never existed as such. And now, perhaps there is no need to become overly philosophical, but, what is the market without the state, and how do we conceptualize these divisions and interactions between the state and the market, right? So I think actually one way to think about this issue of free market ideology, or a faith in the potential of the private sector and of capital to solve all of our problems is more to do with the type of role that the state can play in relation to the private sector. And I think the one problem that we've had within capitalism is that, particularly during neoliberalism, the state has become much less of a regulator of private capital and much more of a facilitator of the private sector, right? And I think this is where actually something needs to change. But in addition to this, I would say that one key issue has to do, for me, with the privatization of public initiatives of collective spaces. And so I think that in terms of overcoming what we might call, free market ideology, or perhaps more correctly, sort of neoliberal ideology, has to do with the reappropriation of public spaces, of collective action. And so words such as reappropriation of collective spaces, socialization of, for example, care and social reproduction, and various forms of production resistance, like Dr. Njeri was saying in her presentation, are all key. And so in this sense, also perhaps to, in a way, respond a little bit to Yannis' provocation, it's not only about looking at governments and policymakers from my perspective, but it's also about thinking about bottom-up initiatives and social movements that can bring about change. And so to link this somehow with the trade question, I think what is interesting is that in terms of global supply chains, we know that during the pandemic, the food chains have been among the most resilient. And of course, this has to do on the one hand with the fact that food is perhaps an essential good, and so those activities have been protected in different ways, but also because it seems that there is evidence that many agricultural and food producers were able to diversify their production and redirect it to the local and domestic market or consumption rather than for exports. And so, and as far as I know, this did not come from any policy initiative from governments, but it came from the initiative of farmers to engage in that type of shift that proved to be actually quite good for boosting the resilience of some, not all, of course, agricultural producers. And so again, it's this idea of thinking about bottom-up initiatives and movements that can bring about change that I think is key to what we are thinking about here in terms of responding to the COVID-19 crisis in effective and transformative ways. And finally, just to say to the question on teaching, and I know that Michelle is incredibly committed to teaching, and actually think we should just have more teachers like Michelle. But I see what you mean in terms of some resistance in engaging with critiques of capitalism. I think that perhaps a starting point is to try to engage in a dialogue over where capitalism falls short of providing all of the answers. So even for people who are actually quite optimistic about capitalism, it should be possible to have a conversation around where capitalism falls short in providing the answers, and where those answers cannot be found within capitalism in a broad sense. Then it's where some of the more critical perspectives might come in and might become more palatable also to people who are more optimistic about our capitalist system. But yes, I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Dafermos?
Thank you so much. I know that we don't have time, so I will try to be very brief. Basically, 3 comments. First of all, on what Sara said about free market ideology, I completely agree. I use this term because this is, in many cases, how economics is taught, especially in the first and the second year. And the free market ideology is always there. But I agree with Sara that in practice, what we have is that the state creates the space for the private sector to increase its profitability, for instance. And this is how things work. So the state is always there, but the main purpose is to support the private sector. And this is actually what we're seeing now with the Wall Street consensus. We have that the state that creates the space for the financial system to create profits. So this is a problem. And how can we deal with that in practice? First of all, I agree with Sara about the importance of having bottom-up approaches, and this is why I also refer to local communities in the question that I had on the slide. My view is that we need, in practice, to do both. We need to have bottom-up approaches combined with significant political changes that come from the top. In what sense? In the sense that it is necessary to give the space to these local communities to do what they believe is best for them. And for instance, if we don't have a redistribution of power in the form of debt relief for countries in the global south, climate reparations, which is also now at the core of the discussion about issues with respect to climate justice, If we don't do these types of things, then the people will have less ability to respond to these challenges. So I think that we really need to see changes both at the bottom up and the top down perspectives. And very quickly on teaching, because we have run out of time, I think it's important, as Sara also mentioned, to be clear on the fact that there are alternatives. And for me, it's always good when I present to students the problems and the questions that we need to answer as economists, and then I say that these questions have been answered in different ways by different schools of economic thought, and it's important for us to learn about these different ways of thinking about economics, and then to decide about what we think is best. If we start by saying that there's a dominant way of thinking and we spend too much time only on that, I think this makes things a bit more difficult. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Dr. Mwagiru?
Yes, let me pick up directly from where Dr. Yannis stopped there, which is I fully agree that in our teaching practice, I think fundamentally it's important for us to encourage multiplicity of perspectives. I think that is one of the main value adds of education, and one of the outcomes should be our ability to accommodate differing perspectives and points of view. And therefore, I think perhaps as educators, for us to also cultivate the space to be in that moment of dialectic tension in order to ensure that our students understand that, especially from a futures perspective, there's no predetermined route or pathway to realize the goals that we want. We really need to ensure that we are inclusive, at least in listening to different perspectives, especially when we face crises and we're looking for solution finding. We need to be as broad seeking as possible. Then in terms of the neoliberal and cherry picking, etc., again, from a futures perspective, we would emphasize that systems always have points of leverage, and the system itself is self-correcting and will also eliminate those aspects of itself that it considers to be weak or non-functional. So the possibility to cherry pick, I think, is something that happens in and of itself in terms of system dynamics, but also in terms of wanting to institute or interject change. It's very important to look at where that may be most rich or where the ground may be most fertile to harbor or appreciate some of the initiatives and change models that we may be introducing. I think it's very much less a question of cherry picking and more a question of trade-offs. Therefore, in selecting certain directions, what do we compromise, or in prioritizing certain areas, where do we perhaps lose, or what might the risks be? And then in terms of policy changes, I would say that, yes, I think there have been policy changes at a macro level. Perhaps it will take longer for us to see the impacts because of the fact that they're macro changes. But I think we can see definitely in terms of a green shift, if we look specifically at the EU, but also across certain industries, there are movements there that are looking at supply chains and logistics and the ways in which to improve efficiencies in these areas. And these are opening up policy directions that could be points of interesting transformation. And then, yes, finally, the point of collaboration. I think I really want to emphasize that as we think of systems as dynamic, collaboration is really important in order to leverage on those positive points, also pull on our comparative advantages, which is part of that multiplicity. And therefore, I think opening up these debates to assume much larger platforms. And I think this then brings in those aspects of imagination and innovation that can otherwise be closed off if we're too siloed in our thinking.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. I see that we managed to keep most of our attendees on, even though we've slightly eaten into their break. But really, this has been such a really great discussion. And like I said earlier, so much to think about, so much to really consider: the ecological impacts, the feminist perspective. What do we think about the futures? What are the actual impacts on the ground, and how the impacts have been asymmetrical? And I think it's clear that they've been asymmetrical among racial, gendered, and multiple intersecting identity lines. And so in thinking about futures and solutions, we really have to challenge ourselves more than we've probably ever done, and at least in my lifetime. I haven't questioned these things at this level, but I hope everybody has been really deeply inspired to really keep on asking the critical questions that are needed for the future of our society, really, and for the future of this world. So thank you so much to all the speakers. It is now a comfort break for the attendees, and I hope that you'll be following the rest of the Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival, the speakers as well as the attendees, and that you'll hear more great things. And this is just one of the amazing sessions that are taking place. Thank you and goodbye.